You're listening to the weekly parsha podcast with Ari Goldwag, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Beit Shemesh, Israel, 5781, 2021. This week's parsha is Parshas Seitze. In our parsha, we have the Torah's command that if a person comes across a nest with a bird, with a mother bird, and baby birds, or eggs that the person would like to take, the baby birds, so there's an obligation. Kan tzipor, you come across this nest, there's an obligation to send away the mother bird before we take the baby birds or the eggs. I'd like to share with you what the Medrash says about this, and I'd like to share with you some thoughts that came up as I was studying this piece with my son Moshe Dov, and as I thought about it further, some very interesting concepts that relate to the idea that the Medrash speaks about, relate to the concept of Mashiach, of our longing for Mashiach, for the Messiah to arrive. And classically, in the deeper sources, the Kan tzipor, this nest sending away the mother bird, is connected to the concept of Mashiach, of the Messiah. Perhaps we can gain a little bit of an understanding, a little bit of a depth into what that connection may be, based on some of the words that the Medrash uses and that the verses use in reference to this concept. Ki Seitze, the verse tells us, Ki yikare kan tzipor lefanecha, it's a verse in chapter 22, verse 6. If you come across a bird's nest, so there's an obligation to send away the mother bird. Now the Medrash starts off with something which seems to be unconnected, but hopefully, as we'll see, of course, every single time we have a Medrash, it always needs to be understood why the Medrash uses one concept, places it next to another concept. The Medrash starts off talking about a tinaik, a child. Let's say one has a child who's born, so there's an obligation to circumcise the child. Let's say the child is born without a foreskin, which does occur. What do? Moshe, are you allowed to circumcise the child on Shabbos? Ordinarily, you're not allowed on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, to cause any kind of a petza, of a blemish on the human body. You can't cause blood to come out. You can't cut one cannot cut oneself. So it should be forbidden to perform a circumcision on Shabbos. However, we find that one is obligated and permitted to do a circumcision on the 8th day on Shabbos. However, the question is, if a child is born without a foreskin, so the obligation for circumcision is done differently. There's something called a tafas dambris, which is a small prick is made, a little drop of blood is let out. The question is that permitted to be done on Shabbos or not? We find that indeed there's an obligation to allow that small drop of blood to come out even on Shabbos, according to the Medrash. I don't know if we actually pass in this way. The verse says, you shall surely circumcise your children. Verse in Genesis chapter 17:13, double language, himol yimol, teaches us that there's an obligation even on Shabbos. The Medrash goes through a few different concepts that we learn out in regards to Milah. I don't want to get into the details of it so much, but what I do want to read to you is what it says in the continuation. Rav Yudin ben Pazi says, Maksiv b'Tziporah. It says Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, was returning. He had married Tziporah, the daughter of Yisro. He was returning with his two sons to Egypt in order to be the Goyel, to be the Jewish people's redeemer. And they were stopped on the path. And as our sages tell us, Moshe Rabbeinu had not given a bris milah to his son. He had not given a circumcision to his son, and he was threatened by a spiritual being who was about to kill him, prevent the entire geula of Am Yisrael. What did Tziporah do, his wife? Tziporah saw that the problem was, she intuitively knew, based on the circumstances as the Chachamim teach us, which I'm not going to get into, she knew, and that the problem was that they hadn't done a bris. So she jumped in and she did a bris. The verses tell us. And the verse finishes off and says, Amra Chasan Damim. Okay, talks about the fact that Tziporah does the Milah. It's very interesting. 2 points you see here. Number one is that it's Tziporah who does it. Tziporah is the wife of Moshe. Tziporah, interestingly, her name means a bird. And we're talking about the topic here is the bird. that you're sending away the mother bird. So it's very interesting. It seems to be a connection. And number two, they're about to go down to be the Goyel. Moshe Rabbeinu is about to become the Redeemer of the Jewish people. He was the Messiah of his generation. And on the way, you got to make sure, if you want to get to Geula, it sounds like from the Medrash, if you want to get to Geula, you have to make sure you do the bris. And there's something intimately connected between the concept of circumcision on the 8th day and the concept of the bris. And there's also something about Tziporah doing it. Perhaps we'll understand that soon. Now the Medrash comes and connects the concept of Mila, the concept of circumcision, to the concept of the tzipor of the bird, sending away the mother bird. How do we connect it as follows? Medrash says that the reason that the child is circumcised on the 8th day, what is the 8th day? Why don't we circumcise him earlier? Why don't we circumcise him as soon as he's born? The answer is because Hashem had compassion upon a child, let him get a little bit of strength. He was just born, recuperate a little from the birth. On the 8th day, Hashem has racham, he has compassion on his children. Just like obviously Hashem has compassion upon people, we also find that God has compassion upon the animals. We find that one does not bring a korban, a sacrifice, before the animal has reached the 8th day of its life. There's a certain aspect of racham in there. We don't right away take away that animal to be sacrificed. And here's where we get back to, one more thing. We're going to get back shortly to the birds. We also find the concept of Hashem's rachamim, his compassion, that he says that you're not to take one animal and the animal's child at the same time. Don't shech them, don't don't shech them, don't slaughter them on the same day. You see this idea of Hashem's rachamim, his compassion. And just like Hashem has compassion upon the animals, Hashem also has compassion upon the birds. One of the deeper understandings of why Hashem asks us to send away the mother bird is because Hashem has compassion on the animals, he has compassion on the birds. Okay, there's a concept here of compassion. Hashem has compassion on the animals. It's interesting. There's also Gemara in Brachos, the Mefarshim talk about that a person is not supposed to say that the concept behind this has to do with compassion. If a person says that, we quiet him down. Okay, whatever the understanding of that is, the Gemara there, we're not going to get into. But what's interesting to me is the connection. What is the connection between the concept of Mila, the concept of the circumcision, and the concept of the tzipor, the bird, that we send away the mother bird? Okay, we see in the Medrash clearly that there's this connection. What is the connection? How does it connect perhaps also to the concept of Geula, as we saw by Moshe Rabbeinu and Tziporah, the bird? The bird. Tziporah was Moshe's wife. Her name means a bird. I was discussing this with my son Moshe Dov, and I noticed that what is the root? What is the root, the two-letter root of the word bird? The word bird in Hebrew is tzipor or Tziporah. So sometimes there are three-letter roots, sometimes there are two-letter roots. You see that letzapos-to means to tweet. A bird tweets. Tzaf. Tzif-tuf is a beep or a tweet. So tzaf, what is the word tzaf, which is the root of the word tzipor? Because the tzipor is really a tzafar. Whenever you have a resh at the end of a word, it means it's something who does this. A tzipor is an animal that is tzaf. What does the word tzaf mean? The word tzaf means to float. We're going to see a few different things about the word tzaf, and we're going to come back to talking about how it connects to us, how it connects to Mashiach, how it connects to the concept of the bris, the circumcision, and how it connects to the concept of sending away the mother bird, hopefully. So the word tzaf means to float. The word tzaf means to float, right? You take something, you put it under the water, you take a piece of wood, you put it on the water, it floats to the top. That's the word tzaf. You have shemen, you have oil, you put it inside of water, the shemen is tzaf, it floats to the top, comes to the top. The word tzaf means to float, and at tzipor, what if you think about it, and the Meforshim speak about why is it that we have this commandment of rachamim, of special compassion that we need to show to a bird? Why is it there that we learn to be compassionate? And one of the explanations is because the tzipor is a spiritual animal. It's an animal that flies. It flies through the air. And I was thinking, a tzipor is an animal that floats. Right? That's why it's called a tzipor, a floater. A bird, you watch a bird, they float in the air. You can even have a bird that is just staying in one spot in the air, because the wind is coming in and it just has its wings outstretched and it stays in one spot. It's tzaf. It floats in the air. It represents floating in a spiritual sense. That's what a bird is. Okay? Now, hold on to that thought. I'd like to share with you somewhere else where we see the word letzapos-to in the concept, in the context of the concept of Mashiach, of the Messiah. Here's the Medrash. It's in Shir Hashem Rabbah, parsha Vav Tezayin. It says like this: Amar Eloi Rabbi Chia Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta. One time, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Rabbi Chia Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta havun mahalchem ahada bekas arbel bekritzta. One time they were walking in a particular valley. They saw the sun rising. They saw the day beginning to come up. I'm sorry, not the sun rising. First they saw the light, the beginning of the day, the light coming up. Amar Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta. Kachtia gulason shal Yisrael metzaftzefes. Rabbi Chia said, this is how the geula, the redemption of the Jewish people is going to be. You see the light coming up as the sun is rising. You don't yet see the sun, but you're watching the light coming up. That's how Mashiach, the Messiah, is going to arrive. It's going to be a gradual metzaftzefes. Now the word metzaftzefes is very interesting here because it's not so clear what metzaftzefes means. We think metzaftzefes ordinarily means to tweet, as we said before. And even the Meforshim have a hard time with the word metzaftzefes exactly. They try to change the girsa, but we're going to see that it's correct, metzaftzefes, because the word metzaftzefes means to float. It means to come up to the top. Dichsiv. The verse says, Ki eshev achoshech Hashem orli. When I sit in the darkness, Hashem is my light. So the light comes. That's how Mashiach comes. That's how the Messiah arrives. We're sitting in the darkness, and the light is slowly arriving. B'tchila hiba kima kima, says the Medrash. Mashiach comes slowly, a drop at a time. Then there's a nitznutz, there's a spark, right? As the sun rises above the horizon, there's a spark. Then the light gets stronger and stronger. It gets bigger and bigger. And it brings that we see this in the story of the Geula with Esther and Mordechai. The Medrash goes into that at length, which we are not going to. Now, when we look at this pasuk, which the Medrash brings as a pasuk in Micha, Ki yeshev achoshech Hashem orli. When I sit in darkness, God is my light. So, looking at the pasuk, we see an amazing thing. I'm going to read one pasuk before, and this is where we see the same word, the tzaf, metzaftzefes, which means to float, or to tweet, to be bird-like. And thinking about tweeting, right? I was thinking about it. When you hear the sound of a bird's whistle, so it's a very high sound. It floats above the other sounds. It has a high frequency. And as a result, the sound is heard above other things. So it's also an aspect of floating, is in the tzif, in the tweeting. But hear this, because it's amazing. Pasuk says, V'ani b'Hashem, this is right before the Pasuk, Yeshev b'choshech Hashem ali. Listen carefully. V'ani b'Hashem atzapeh, achila lekeishi. And I shall hope to God. I will hope to the God of my salvation. It's speaking about, this is the verses in Micha, chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, speaking about our desire for Mashiach. And the way that we speak about the desire is atzapeh. The root of atzapeh is the same two letters, tzaf. Tzaf. It's very interesting. What is the concept here? Tzipisa Yeshua, that's one of the questions that they ask a person after they die. They come to Shemaim, one of the first questions they asked, did you hope? Were you waiting for? Was it constantly on your mind? Was it floating at the surface of your consciousness? The tzipor. This is something I care about. This is something I'm worried about. This is something I'm thinking about. When is Mashiach going to come? Yishma'ini Lekai. Says the verse, if I am constantly thinking about Mashiach, if I'm tzipis al Yeshua, I'm waiting, it's on my mind, it's floating on the top of my consciousness, Hashem is going to listen. Al tismechi oyavti li, ki nafalti kamti. Do not allow, says the next verse, do not allow my enemies to rejoice over me when I fall. I get up. Ki yeshev hachoshech, Hashem or li. When I sit in the darkness, Hashem is my light. So that's the verse, which refers to the fact that the pasuk says, metzaftzefes. There's going to be a floating up, a rising of the sun, a rising of the light, because that's the atzapeh, that's this hope. Hope is rising. Hope rises. Okay, now another really cool thing I was thinking about that I noticed is that these two letters of the root of the word tzaf, which is a bird, which is a desire, letzapot, which is a letzapos-to, to tweet, to float, etc. The two letters are tzadi and pei, and as we spoke about in a previous podcast not so long ago, these are two of the 5 letters that you have doubles, right? Manspach, mem sofis, nun sofis, tzadi sofis, pei sofis, and chaf sofis. And these are the 2 letters. Pakadati denotes Mashiach ben Yosef, and tzadi, tzemach, tatzmiach denotes the letter of Mashiach ben David. These 2 letters, tzadi and pei, represent the coming of Mashiach, the geula, the redemption, the final redemption that we're waiting for. How does it come? It floats. It floats. Another place you see these letters, I was discussing with my son, is the word matzpun. The word matzpun means conscience. The person's conscience means inside of a person, ki yeshev bachoshech Hashem or li, means inside of a person there is darkness. I want to do what I feel like doing. There's a conscience. What is the conscience of a person? It's a sense of what's right. I know what's right. Even when I do what's wrong, there's guilt. I feel guilt. Guilt is good. Guilt is important. It means that I have a conscience which says, I recognize I'm doing something wrong. That's the matzpun. The light of Hashem, ki yeshev bachoshech, the darkness that I'm in, Hashem or li, there's a light of my conscience which floats to the top of my consciousness. That's also there within this idea. Now let's come back for a moment to the concept of the bris and the concept of the tzipor, the sending away of the mother bird. And we'll see, perhaps we'll start to understand a bit of how this relates to what we've been speaking about. The concept of the bris is on the 8th day. The concept of the number 8 always has to do, we have 7, which is teva, 7, which is the natural world, 7, which is the lower 7 spheros, and you have the 8th aspect, which is the transcendent aspect. The shmini, the 8th aspect, shemen, oil floats to the top, as we said. Oil floats to the top, is tzaf, it floats to the top. The 8th aspect is the transcendent aspect, it's me'al teva, it's above nature. That is represented by the word tzaf as well, floating to the top. Right? Mashiach, why is he called the Messiah? Why is he called Mashiach? Because they pour in him shemen. He's mashuach b'shemen. He's anointed with oil, which represents the fact that he floats to the top. He's the one who includes all the Klal Yisrael within him. He guides them all to do what's right. That's the power of Mashiach, to draw the Jewish people back to God, to draw the entire world back to God, to the focus, the proper focus. He raises the sun. The sun rises because of Mashiach. The sun rises. The sun is the sun of consciousness. The concept of Mila, on the 8th day, circumcision means we take the animal drive, which is really the creative force. It's one of the most powerful forces in the world. the desire to procreate, the animal, it seems to be an animal, we take it and we lift it up. Interestingly, Hashem is rachamim on the people, Hashem is rachamim on the animals and the birds. We are raising up our animal nature. It's off, it flies, it's tzaf, it floats up. We are raising it up by dedicating ourselves through the milah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to using our capacities, our procreative capacities, in the proper way, in the service of God, because it can also be used in the choshech, but we need the conscience. And the Torah guides our consciousness. It guides our minds. It guides our ability to use it correctly, because it can be used poorly. Look at the Western world. Look how they use the procreative drive in a destructive way, in relationships that are forbidden by the Torah, that are abomination in the Torah, or relationships that are inappropriate because they're between people who shouldn't be together. The Torah describes and guides us, and that's represented by the bris milah, which is done on the 8th day, because it needs to be transcendent. We need to take the aspect of ourselves, which is the 7, which is natural, and to raise it up to the 8th aspect, which is the supernatural. And the rachamim, that mercy of God, has to be in the right way, in the right frame, in the way that God commands us, right? Because you can have mercy on animals, and that can become more important than having mercy on people. You might know this, or you might not know this, but the Germans, the Nazis, were very compassionate to animals. They had very strong laws to protect animals. Hitler himself was an animal lover. But they could kill human beings. Cold-blooded murder. Millions and millions of Jews. 6.25 million Jews. If it's not guided with the proper rachmanis, right? We did mention before, right? There's a compassion Hashem has for the mother bird. Send away the mother bird when you take the children. But make sure you use it in the right way. It has to be directed based on what the Torah says, because only the Torah defines, only God defines what is called racham and what's called compassion. If the compassion is used wrong, so then you just end up in the wrong place. You end up being cruel to the kind and being kind to the cruel. A person takes the food and he eats it. He's taking this animal, right? He's taking the baby birds. He's taking it away. There needs to be compassion there. There needs to be compassion there. Because you're allowed to take the animals. We're allowed to use them in order to have the strength. We're allowed to eat animals. We're supposed to incorporate all the elements of reality into our service of God, as long as it's directed properly. There needs to be an aspect of rachamim. Even as we're taking the baby birds, there needs to be an aspect of rachamim on the mother. You can't take away the mother at the same time. Just like you can't slaughter a parent and a child, so to speak, of an animal and its young at the same time. You can't do that. It has to be directed properly. That's the matzpun. That is the conscience of a person rises. It comes to the forefront of the person's consciousness. It's tzaf. It comes to the top. I thought it was interesting also, Moshe Rabbeinu is called Moshe. He was floating on the water in that little teva, that little boat, call it, not a boat, a little basket. And she draws him out of the water. There he is. And his wife's name is Tziporah, which also means to float. A bird that floats on the air. Moshe is one who floats on the water. Tziporah's wife is someone who floats. But it's Dafka Tziporah who has that consciousness, who has that 8th aspect, which, by the way, is Bina. Women are gifted with the extra Bina, the extra intuition. They have that ability. What happens when a person has intuition? And intuition is connected to the number 8, to this concept of floating, of floating to the top, of transcending. You see a bigger picture, right? A person who has intuition, they see the big picture. The information is tzaf. You see the big picture. The sun is coming up. Mashiach is arriving. The Geula happens. Right before the Geula happens, it's Dafka Tziporah. It's specifically that Bina, that intuition of someone named Tziporah, whose tzaf rises above, who's able to see we need the milah. We need the proper direction. Before we can have Geula, before we can go down there and be the redeemers of the Jewish people, we need this. We need the tzadi and the pei. We need the floating. We need the matzpun. We need the tzipisa. We need the desire. We need the conscience. And we need that, I really want this. I want Mashiach so much. I want Mashiach so much. I want the Messiah to arrive so much. I want to see God revealed in the world. And that consciousness to be revealed, that sun to rise. I think that we perhaps explained a bit of the connections here between the concept of bris and the tzipor, an idea of the tzaf, of floating. I want to bless you and ask you to bless me. Hashem should help us to be able to indeed hear the voice of our consciousness, of our conscience in our consciousness. It should float up. When we're in the darkness, we should be able to have that light of Hashem. When we're facing whatever challenges it might be, proper direction of our eating abilities, of our procreation abilities, whatever it is, when we're sitting in that darkness, Hashem should be that light for us, guiding us and using them the proper way. And Hashem should help us, that we should be zeiche to see the tzif, the metzaftzefes, the sun rising of the geula, of that redemption, which is so close. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.